Do you think that your ADHD or your neurodivergent conditions are your superpowers? Do you think that if everyone just knew what you knew, it could be their superpower as well? Or does being told those things upset and offend you? Do you think it negates your struggles and challenges? Perhaps you think that the superpowers thing is just there to help children understand being different? This conversation may not go where you think.
Andrew, we're back and we're going to talk about superpowers.
Good.
Yes. So look, here's the thing, everybody. We have chosen to talk about something because this is a word that comes up time and time again in conversations about lots of different neurodivergent conditions, particularly in terms of ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. I see it all the time. These things are superpowers. I will hold my hand up before we begin and say, yes, I have been the first to leap from a very great height on people who have publicly posted saying, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD and it's my superpower and I think it's a superpower for everyone if. And the reason I've jumped on them, Andrew, and I think this is what this episode is really important to do, is because I don't mind if they think it's their superpower at that point, but it's not responsible for them to tell everyone else it's a superpower as well, because there are so many people who do not feel superpowered by these things. And that's why I think this is something that for you and I is a good thing to discuss. And the great thing is we can both sort of geek out a bit and use some real analogies from the super world and the comic book world to draw parallels. Let's start with the validity piece. Okay. For you, when you see people who are either new to their awareness that they may be or new to a diagnosis, do you think it makes sense that sometimes they want to lean on everything that feels more positive and therefore may refer to themselves as having superpowers?
This goes back to the meaning of a diagnosis, I think, Matt. In that, when you're diagnosed, the explanation of how you are has changed, and it's quite seductive when you've been told all of your life that something is wrong to say, hey, actually, some of that gives me great strength and great abilities, because you've been told all along it's wrong, and then someone said, actually, there's an explanation for that. There's a reason why that is the case. And it might not be that you've been bitten by a radioactive spider, but it is that someone has said, think differently about this. And that is a very liberating experience. To, we talked about that where we talked about diagnosis. It lifts a weight. So it can feel all of a sudden like the things that you've thought were wrong and the things that you've criticized yourself about are a superpower. All of a sudden, because the way that you've been told to see those things has changed from persistent criticism and why are you always late? Why do you always say the wrong thing? All that sort of stuff. Suddenly been, you can now say, because I can get lost in something for hours and be more creative than you can ever hope to be. And that is a superpower. Yeah. So it is, we used the word bombastic, didn't we, in that episode? It is that bombastic, hey, this is different.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it is different. As to whether it's
almost
a superpower,
celebratory.
Yeah, as to whether it's a superpower, I'm not sure about that.
See, for me, and it's a conversation I have regularly, I first came across people talking about ADHD, autism being superpowers when my sons were diagnosed. So I'm going back 2009. Now, digging a little bit further, doing some research into when this first became something that was being said very often, actually, it's very late 1990s, early 2000s, which just happens to coincide with, on a very large scale, resurgence of the superhero movie franchise.
Yeah.
Right? The Spider-Mans, the Batmans. It's when they were taken off again. And I've always said this, and I stand by it. If you are a parent of a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old child, even older, and they have got this new information that they are different, and they've had a tough time in nursery or school or wherever, being able to say to them, hey, but it's a bit like having a superpower because you've got lots of energy, you can do things really fast, you're really good at thinking about things. I am all for that. Go for it, knock yourself out. Let that kid run around feeling they've got superpowers and telling everyone they've got superpowers, because it helps. Because at that point, that child doesn't have enough experience of life, and hopefully hasn't had enough experience of maybe understanding negative experiences either, for the real damage to be that obvious yet, right? So telling them it's a superpower, great, go for it. But once we come into adulthood, once we've got adults saying this is a superpower in that bombastic way, I think very often the reason it hurts, and everyone that I've spoken to about this says the reason it hurts when they see that bombastic, and I think it's a superpower, and it is if you've just, and if you do the same things I do, and if you've got a really good team around you, and all these things I've seen only in the past few weeks are ifs. It's a superpower if you've got the same things as me, you can do the same things as me. And it completely ignores the fact that not everyone has, can, and does, which then makes those people who don't have the ability to have those things in place, who haven't got lots of support networks around them, who are just struggling through their day-to-day lives to compute what it means to have dyslexia, ADHD, autism. It makes them, and it made me in my past, feel like, oh great, I have got the crap version of this then, because I didn't get the superpowers. Because at that point, I don't see that. And I think that's the distinction. I think, like I say, I'm okay if you want to say that, but putting it into the realm of, Stan Lee, godfather of modern superhero world, he was very clear, as you and I have discussed, when he was talking about superpowers, that yes, there were always powers, but there was a flip side, right? There is always a flip side to being able to. And in the real world, it's that isn't discussed. And again, I've been accused of saying, oh, you just want it all negative. Would you want every news report to be negative? No, I just want it to be realistic.
Yeah.
Really?
Well,
To acknowledge it?
I think I'll talk about what's gone through my mind, because you talked about Stan Lee and for the birth of Marvel and all of that. That happened in the 1950s when everybody was feeling pretty rough after a world war, and the day-to-day grind was hard. I mean, there was the 1950s and things picked up, but actually there was a sense of, we need some escapism, we need some fantasy, we need to be able to think beyond our humanity, and that's where superheroes came from. It's, what if we had a superpower, and can we play with those ideas? The favorite superhero, and I do talk to children about this, and I talk about superpowers in clinic with children, with boys, is always Spider-Man. And the reason for that is because he's a boy. Boys, not neurodivergent boys, all boys relate to Spider-Man because he's a boy who's, his uncle was shot in front of him. He's had some tough times, and then he has this misfortunate accident that unlocked something different in him, and it's his journey of making sense of that. And the superhero story is quite helpful, but to just say it's all wonderful for Peter Parker, it's not true, because he's dealing with the grief of the loss of Uncle Ben. He's dealing with, who am I, and how do I live these two lives? How do I deliver pizza and fight crime at night time? And it's not just, hey, I can climb walls. That's not what Stan Lee was saying. Stan Lee was saying, okay, you can have this difference, but how do you use that, and how do you adjust to that? Now you've got it. So there's so much that goes beyond, this is my superpower. Yes, there are strengths, and yes, we should be promoting a strengths-based narrative to children who have, come to a diagnosis because they're struggling, because they're getting criticised, because they're not performing like their peers in class. But to just say, hey, all of that doesn't matter because you've been bitten by a radioactive spider and now you can climb walls, is really reducing. It almost externalizes the reality of having underactive dopamine transmission in your prefrontal
Yeah.
cortex. Yeah. So yeah, like you, I think there's value in highlighting difference and saying, hey, it's not all bad. Let's not say it's all good either. Let's say it's
No.
different. Yeah.
I agree. It's weird. I was just thinking about the old sort of 80s Spider-Man cartoons while you were talking then, sort of my generation cartoons. And I was thinking, what was it I resonated with? Because I was dumb and I dressed up as Spider-Man. I wanted to be Spider-Man and I ended up being a rock climber. So I never stopped trying to be Spider-Man, right? But thinking back, I remember resonating with the fact that he was told off a lot. He seemed to always be being told off, right? He seemed to always be almost nearly not quite getting in trouble and be really good at sort of talking himself out of that and coming up with reasons for. But I can look back as an adult and go, and now I can see how exhausting being Spider-Man was. You know, when I used to watch the cartoons and you see it in the films where he's crashed on his bed and he can't do anything and he's been yelled at by his aunt, you know, you can look at that and go, oh, just a teenager. I look at it and go, no, he's absolutely flipping exhausted from doing this because switching on the superpowers to fight crime, to do whatever, is a massive drain on resource. It's a massive ask. And you know, he is the definition of masking as well.
Yeah, that's exactly
He's
what's going through my
literally
mind.
putting that mask on. He's literally doing that so he can do other, right? But actually, if you step back from very often again, that conversation we have now with adults about masking is I should be able to unmask and still be me. No, because you wouldn't be you if you unmasked in the workplace, like completely. If Peter Parker took the mask off, and those occasions where he's caught swinging from building to building without costume, what does it cause? It's problems. Now, there are people that will say, well, that's just because people need to accept that he can do those things without being in a costume. Or is it? Is it that that's not right for him to do? Is it that that's not necessary for him to do, but he needs to be able to explain why he's shattered and why he needs rest and how tiring it is. Okay, if he's unmasked completely and says, actually, no, hey, I'm Spider-Man, and by the way, when I'm saving the world, it takes 1,000% more energy, and then I'm shattered, would that lead to a bit more acceptance from people? Maybe. Well, there's parallels in the real world. But I think it's this thing of the abilities, and I'm all for an abilities based conversation and a strengths based conversation. It's what I say to every single one of my clients and people I mentor. Let's find your strengths. Finding our strengths takes a toll. And just like the superhero model, displaying your strengths, whilst they may look unique and way better than anyone else, they also take a toll. And it's what are you doing that's a coping mechanism? What are you doing to decompress? What are you explaining what that looks like? Because if you're not, and you're just saying it's a superpower, people aren't getting the whole picture. And we're not helping people without understand the full experience of what it means to be a neurodivergent person who sometimes looks like they're unnaturally good at, and at other times just can't get off the sofa.
There's that, but it's what's gone through my head for about the past 10 minutes is this applies not just to those of us with ADHD, those of us that are diagnosed autistic. This is a human thing. And we often talk about, you know, what's ADHD, what's being human. And I think a lot of this sort of seduction of superpowers, it's built into society that we you know, you're arrogant if you talk about your strengths. You know, I've been a mental health nurse for 30 years and lots has changed, but what's been persistent is with pretty much everyone I've seen, including myself, is a sense that our strengths somehow sit lower down the agenda than our vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And that's not just something that happens in ADHD and autism. It happens in humanity. And superheroes are it's almost a thought experiment by Stan Lee to say, what if we externalize that strength and make it fantastic and explore that? But, you know, your 6-year-old in a Spider-Man suit is just fascinated by the idea of climbing walls. But as you say, as we get older, we start to see the subtlety of the superhero narratives. We start to think Batman's better. Yeah,
Yeah.
we start to think, oh, okay, that dark and broody type, and start to see the subtleties in other superheroes, because it's a way of abstracting out some quite complex ideas. There's that word again. I think that's going to become my word, complex, because it is complex. We're humans, and it's
Yeah.
these sort of headline ideas. They're great, but there's always more behind it. And this one is perhaps the most in-your-face one. And I think when we're talking about superpowers, we need to think about what Stan Lee meant when he came up with the idea.
It's an interesting way to frame that. And I'm now wondering, I'm going through the sort of the Rolodex in my head, showing my age of the kind of superheroes maybe you and I grew up with and the ones we see now. And there isn't a single character that I can think of who doesn't have written into their story, their narrative, their vulnerabilities. We discussed offline the Hulk, right? And now I'm a Luverino Hulk. I'm proper Hulk.
Yeah,
I'm real Hulk. None of this
proper.
CGI nonsense, right? But the Hulk is, I think, a really good example of this, right? Because if you think about it, for me as an adult, I now think, well, actually, surely Dr. David Banner was the genius. He was the one with the phenomenal scientific talent. The Hulk, that massive adrenaline spike, and then being dysregulated. Wait a minute. Doesn't that sound really familiar? Doesn't that sound very like being dysregulated or having an RSD flare up or being told you're too much and it taking a long time to come down and it having destructive consequences? All of a sudden, if we start looking at what it means when we talk superheroes, superpowers, there's this alternate way, and it really does parallel. It really does parallel the conditions we're talking about. And again, I just think it's so important before people talk on behalf of others that they think of those things as well. You know, the amount of adults I talk to that go, what if it's a superpower? I want a refund, right? Yeah, I know. If your life feels mostly struggle and challenge, if you're still at a point where we've spoke about this again on podcasts, if you haven't got to that point of acceptance yet of yourself, of this new information, you are not really going to be able to pinpoint what it is you feel great about yourself, right? And it's the balance. You're right, it's complexity. It's the complexity and the balance of understanding yourself and being comfortable with yourself and going, okay, there are days where I'm a bit Banner, there are days where I'm a bit Hulk. And knowing what you need and knowing how to communicate that as well, right? And I think that's what's important, because I can now think of so many different heroes, superheroes, that draw parallels to different conditions.
Yeah, it's all of them. You can't find a superhero. I've tried. You can't find a superhero that there isn't some useful thought to be had around difference and dealing with that difference, because that's the whole genre. That's what it's for. It's to explore that. But we're not 6 and we're not wearing Spider-Man costumes. Not anymore. So
Speak for yourself.
to just grab the headline is missing so much of the undertone and you know, that sad music as Bill Bixby walks up the road with his bag on his back. You know, used to get me every week. And yeah, I'd look forward to the Hulk appearing on screen, but actually there was something about him walking up that road with the bag on his back, lonely and unable to connect with the world. Because of the Hulk, that even as a primary school kid hit me.
Yeah, it does. Okay, it's interesting. I'm saying again, we can draw lots of parallels, right? You and I could geek out on this, and I'm sure there will be plenty of other people, and we could put it into multiple different genres as well. That when it's written as a story, the vulnerabilities and the challenges are never shied away from.
Hi folks, it's Matt. Sorry to butt in, but I'll be really quick. It would really help us
if you could take a minute to do a few things to help this podcast reach more people. Wherever you're listening, if you could like it, assuming that you do, if you could subscribe wherever you're choosing to listen to this or watch it, and if you could jump onto the YouTube link and leave a comment about the episode that you've just listened to, Andrew and I would really appreciate it, because that all really helps this podcast reach more people. For now, I'll stop waffling on and we'll get back to go back to this original point. And I don't know whether you see this in clinic or not. I tend to find there are two distinct camps when people are beginning to figure out that it might be ADHD, autism, etc. Right? There's the one I discussed earlier, which is, in order to help me feel better about this, I'm only going to focus on my quote unquote superpowers, right? And I'm only going to talk about those because I feel that's the more positive, the better way of speaking about it. There are then the other camp who perhaps have been more challenged and had more struggles and haven't had the successes and everything else, who can't focus on anything that they do well. And when I mentor people and say, so let's focus on what is it you're good at, I don't know. Nothing. No, everyone is good at something. Not superpowered, but able, right? But there are these two distinct camps. And do you think that that's maybe based on where they got their understanding and their information about what it means to be someone with from in the first place, which is a broader conversation about this difference between social media information and researched information or lived experience information, as well as their own sort of experiences?
I think we're in danger of over specialising this conversation, because I think this is something that everybody wrangles with. And yes, we're a bit like the canary in the coal mine. We're more likely to experience this because we're more different. We're outliers. But actually, this is something that everybody wrangles with. This is a cultural, social phenomenon. How do I pitch myself as someone who is reasonable without sounding arrogant, but without also being a bit crap? Well, actually, we can say, yes, I've got this strength, but I'm not good at this. But it's not something socially that we do as a society. We're not good at it. We're not taught to do that. We're taught to be the same. The expectation is to be the same. And it has been for a long time. That's why Stan Lee developed superheroes, to allow us to think outside of that. But we don't want to get stuck outside of that. We need to come back in and say, hey, I do have strengths. I do have value. And yes, I do have needs and I do have vulnerabilities, and I'm wrapped up in this imperfect bundle of both. And that isn't about autism or ADHD. That's about being a person.
It's about people. Yeah, it is. And I think that does tie back into things we've said already in this season of episodes about the labels, the names are important for certain people. Right now, as a person with, yes, I'm comfortable with saying I have ADHD, autism, etc. But realistically, that was for the clinicians to say I met that criteria. But what I want and what I try and advocate for other people is that we get to a place where we can explain who we are and how we are and why we are and where we're good and not so good without needing it to be defined by a clinical term, without apologizing because there's a label attached to it, about it just being there are days when I'm hyper focused, can get loads done, and then there are other days because of the way I'm wired that I can't. Now, it's interesting. I think we're a long way from that being possible for most people. I think we're a long way from society accepting that, because society seems to want the label. And it's interesting that here are we talking about this label of superpowers. There's another conversation then, isn't there, is we do seem to be fixated on feeling like the label is the knowledge when it's not. The label isn't the knowledge. The label is just words. The knowledge is sit down and talk to that person about what it means to be. And it feels like
Yeah.
we've lost that ability to do that, whether it's in social media posts, in conversations. We've lost the ability to say, can I just talk to you about me? Can I explain?
Hi folks, it's Matt. Sorry to butt in, but I'll be really quick. It would really help us if you could take a minute to do a few things to help this podcast reach more people. Wherever you're listening, if you could like it, assuming that you do, if you could subscribe wherever you're choosing to listen to this or watch it, and if you could jump onto the YouTube link and leave a comment about the episode that you've just listened to, Andrew and I would really appreciate it, because that all really helps this podcast reach more people. For now, I'll stop waffling on and we'll get back to
Me.
But this is what science does. Science reduces things down to understandable bite-sized chunks. The butterflies pinned to a board with a long Latin name in the Natural History Museum, that doesn't tell you what it's like to be a butterfly, but it does show you what they look like. So we have to focus in on different bits in order to have this understanding of something. It's not possible to know everything. That's the wonder, isn't it? You can always find out new stuff. We go down rabbit holes all the time, and it's exciting. But you have to understand that that rabbit hole isn't all knowledge. It's one piece of knowledge. Now, I'm intentionally talking about stuff well away from what we're talking about, because that's the nature of science. Understanding, you need to narrow your focus. You need to reduce the amount of information, because otherwise you get overwhelmed.
I get that. I'm just trying to figure out how I rationalize this. I get that that's the point of science. And like you say, the butterflies on the board does the job. I'm wondering when we, as a society, started to think that we all had to apply a broadly scientific model to understanding, rather than, if you like, a conversational model or a human model of understanding of what it meant to be a person. It's like the amount of posts online I see where people are saying psychology says this, and then the psychologist will say no, it doesn't. Never said such a thing, right? But we seem hell bent on picking up on threads or strands of things and taking them as hard fact, or as the right way to have that conversation, when actually maybe that's not the case. And I'm actually sat here reflecting on the way I then therefore react to the superpower conversation, going, is that because there's an element of me that's stuck in that approach of trying to explain it in a knowledge-based way? That's the right term. And what that person that's saying it's their superpower and nothing else is doing is saying it in a more experiential way at that time. And it's about getting the two to meet rather than feeling that they're constantly butting. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of literature about this. You will get, so it's that debate between quantitative data and qualitative data, and you will get people saying, well, qualitative data isn't really research, because qualitative data is talking to people about their experience and getting sort of that rich human understanding. So there is research that takes that approach, and it is useful. But the seduction is towards the quantitative data, where it's, you can measure it. We know that water boils at 100 degrees. We know that it freezes at 0 degrees. And that is very, very comfortable, because it just is. That's what science gives us. It gives us that. It is. Because we can show it with this experiment. Therefore, it is. And until we understand it better, we'll accept that as what it is. And actually, maybe the conversation about superpowers does sit more in the qualitative side of things, and to try and reduce it to, oh, you shouldn't talk about having superpowers. Actually, we maybe need to move more towards, well, let's talk about the value of talking about superpowers and how that fits in with the conversation about strengths, and how that fits in with the reductionism that calls ADHD a disorder, or autism a disorder, because it needs to reduce it down to diagnostic criteria in order to open up the understanding of the science that sits behind that. So I think we as a species are very seduced by how great science is at giving us absolute answers. And it can be uncomfortable to say that that will never give us all of the answers. Science isn't looking to write the whole playbook. It's just trying to evolve our understanding. And then beyond that are things that science hasn't yet understood. And both views, both perspectives are useful, but you can't have just one. You can't just choose one. You have to have both, and you have to become skilled at knowing that when you choose one, there is still an element of the other one. So when you say, hey, I've got superpowers, okay, that's great. But let's not lose sight of the fact that if you have been diagnosed with ADHD, part of the diagnostic criteria is you have a significant functional impairment. Those are the words in the diagnostic criteria. They're not my words.
Yeah.
So you can't have those superpowers without what is socially defined as a significant functional impairment.
Yeah.
And you have to sit with that tension, just like you can't be Superman without being vulnerable to kryptonite.
No. But it is that, again, to go back, that is the analogy, isn't it? And it's one that we see a lot in this conversation. But it is, you have to acknowledge the kryptonite if you're going to acknowledge Superman.
Yeah. That's the important part.
You have to acknowledge, like Stan Lee tried to get us to do, you have to acknowledge, and here's a word that people will hate, but you have to acknowledge the deficit in order to acknowledge the ability. We have to. And to not to is reductionism in its own way. Just as the medical model can be reductionist, and we've said that many times, to not acknowledge deficit or to gloss over it because we feel our superpowers are so much different to everyone else's, that's not a good way to go either. I think it's this important thing, again, it's the complexity of, it's not to say right or wrong in this, for me, it's to say balance. I stand by what I said earlier on. I don't believe anyone. If you think it's your superpower and that's what you want to lean into, just use I and me and my statements whenever you speak in public, and avoid for other people statements and we and us statements, because you don't have that ability to speak for everyone else, just like I am not here. I'm just saying I can speak for me and the people I've worked with, and I can share the sum total of their experiences, but I can't speak for everyone because I've never met everyone, right? And so you can say it's your superpower until you're blue in the face, right? But you can't tell everyone it's theirs. And I think the danger is, and I go back to some of the statements we see, very often it's reductionism when it's spoken about, of somebody seems to have found their system that works, right? This is normally where I see the superpowers conversation cause an issue. Someone's found a system for them that works. They're managing their condition, whatever it may be, in a particular way. At that point in time, feels like it's working
for them.
And then when they speak, very much of a, yeah, but then when they speak, it's, and if everyone else did that, you'd have a superpower as well. Nope. We've spoken about this a lot, right? I saw recently, I've seen a few things where people have said, oh, well, if you do breath work and cold water therapy and mindfulness and you get the right exercise and nutrition and sleep, you can manage your ADHD. Right, hold on a minute. Right? I do all of those things. I do all of them. And yet I still struggle with my ADHD at times. I still struggle with autism at times, right? And yet I do all of those protocols. So that can't be said that if you just do that, you'll be able to manage it like me, because it doesn't work like that for everyone. If they work for someone else,
and all of those
great.
things
These work for me, I think, because it's the way to do it.
Yeah, all of those things probably do help a bit,
yeah.
And medications help a bit. But it's that looking for the hack. It's looking for the, I just need to flick a button and everything's going to be all right. Well, that's not real life. That is off in the science fiction fantasy world. That's not being a grown-up. And it's okay to have these ideas and these thought experiments of what your strengths are. But I think you're right. It's possible for me to say I have a superpower, but it's not possible for me to say that your strengths are a superpower. I should be talking about your strengths. because if I say it's a superpower for you,
No.
I'm externalizing your strengths, and that could devalue your strengths.
Right. So here's a little bit of lightness to wrap this up. Because I think this conversation is one where you and I are very much always on the same page about this. And we are on this conversation. There's a place for people feeling it's their superpower, but there's a place for balance and context and understanding it. But knowing that you and I both grew up with this, I'm trying to now sit here and think, out of all of the superheroes that we see and we grow up with, which of them do you think are really very good examples of the kind of characteristics we see played out by some of the conditions we talk about a lot? Because for me, the Hulk is ADHD rage every time. That running on adrenaline, crash. That's the Hulk. But I'm wondering what others you think kind of point to some of the traits that we can see in real life, but in that comic book world.
I've said it before, but the one that works best for me, I'll tell you my headline one first. My headline one is Batman, because he doesn't have any magical powers. His powers come from his desire to fight back against the hard times he's had. He goes out at night, and he went and trained in martial arts and all that sort of stuff, but it was his effort that went into that. And in the face of adversity, and which is hard to say, isn't it? But this is that tension, because he did all of that as the son of a billionaire. But putting that to one side, there's something about the brooding darkness of having this history that drives him forward. And I think that is, for me, that is the most relatable superhero in terms of generally the experience of a later diagnosis. I've been thinking about Daredevil lately as well. So Daredevil, visually impaired, still a superhero, and it's made me think about what is his superpower. So I think when I'm yes, we can take the headlines like Hulk and Superman and those sort of fantastic, magical superpowers, Thor, and sort of relate symptoms to that. But actually, I'm more interested in the, perhaps they are the more grown-up superheroes, the ones that are wrangling with the dark side of their superness. So yeah, I don't want to get into. I don't want to get into, it is Spider-Man's Spidey senses some kind of sort of impulsive intuition, or that we could get into that, but actually, for me, the superhero narrative is about dealing with those superpowers, whatever they are. And I think whichever superhero you look at, yes, you will see features of difference, because that's the very point. And then it's the story of that superhero is how they live with that difference in a world that criticizes it. X-Men's perfect. Like the whole narrative of the X-Men is, these guys are different and they're outside of society. Are they useful to society or are they not? For me, the whole superhero story is about that thought experiment of if there is that significant difference, how does that then fit in with the world?
Yeah. And I think I would only add to that, and there's no right or wrong way to figure that out. When each of these characters within their universe discovers their powers, whatever, and it's interesting because we've got some from childhood, some who come to them late in life, right? Funny that there's a parallel. It doesn't matter, but there's always a journey, isn't there, to them understanding, dealing with, and then accepting, right? There is always that parallel to what it means to be diagnosed with something, and I think that's important, that everyone's experience of this is likely to be that different thing, but we can definitely draw on the superhero universe and say, yes, we are probably all able to say at certain times we feel enabled. We can lean into the things we're good at. Let's just remember to acknowledge that it's not constant, it's not 24/7, and that if we're talking on behalf of others, we do need to acknowledge that, yes, They have these great abilities and can have, but the cost is, and the toll is. And I think as long as we keep doing that, we have better conversations, and hopefully we have more human conversations that other people can understand as well.
I'd like to add something in as a clinician that's just come to mind. I know we're wrapping up, but this is an important point that often comes up in clinic, and that is the sense that medication unleashes a superpower. So often when people first have their medication, they finally can get things done. Yeah, at last, and they lean into that. In no time at all, they're burned out because it's not enhancing the superpower, it's changing the focus, and that I've seen a lot of people stumble with that. So I often will say, look, be lazy, dial it back. If you're starting medication, you're adjusting to a change. Let that be enough. Let's not get excited and say, oh well, just because we can complete tasks now doesn't mean we should do them all.
Yeah,
You know,
I couldn't
you're not
agree
going to get.
more.
You're not going to get.
If only I'd known that. You see, because damn it, that's what I thought they were. Is that? Shit. Damn. We should figure that one out. Never mind. Right, Andrew, listen, I hope I've really enjoyed that conversation. I think it's an important one to have. It's something that's never going to go away. But the point here is, let's maybe understand the conversation and where it comes from, and respect each other's and everyone else's views, but just be a bit mindful of how we say what we say on behalf of others. And make sure it's as helpful as it can be. But listen, thank you very much, folks. I hope you have enjoyed that. As we say, please, it does help us if you, wherever you listen to or watch this, if you subscribe, if you can leave a comment, like this episode, it really makes a difference, just so that more people get to see this. And we'll see you next week for another Talk ADHD.